All right. Hello again, and welcome to the GCF Global Programming Conference session on private sector engagement. My name is Ayaka Fujiwara. I'm the Climate Investment Specialist at the Private Sector Facility of Green Climate Fund, and I am delighted to moderate this very interesting discussion. This session will explain from my side the key elements of the private sector strategy, which has been approved in the recent board in B32, and how they will affect the GCF's funding modalities going forward, including readiness, project preparation facilities, and funding proposals. By having live case studies from our AE Acumen and our DAE 5C, we will discuss in details how these modalities will help us achieve the shift in portfolio from mitigation to adaptation, which is currently underfinanced and needing more flows of investment from private sector. Our aim is that at the end of the session, you will have a good idea on how GCF will implement the strategy with our investment and how we will support NDAs and DAEs in order to enhance engagement with the local private sector. For the benefit of participants on site and online, we will be having the Q&A session at the end. So if you are on Huba app, please feel free to submit your question on Huba and we will take it up later. If you're here live with me, then please raise your hand at the Q&A if there's gonna be a 15-minute session. Now, I have the distinct honor of introducing you to our guest speakers of this session. So first, I'd like to welcome Mr. Amar Inamdar, Managing Director of Kawisafi Ventures Acumen, which is our accredited entity at GCF. Amar brings over 25 years of private sector experience in building markets and businesses in emerging economies. He's the Managing Director of Kawisafi Ventures, a private investment fund created by Acumen and also anchored by Green Climate Fund, which is focused on energy access in Africa. Second, to his left, I'd like to introduce Dr. Colin, the Executive Director of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, our regional direct access entity. 5C is an intergovernmental organization that coordinates the Caribbean's response to managing and adapting to climate change. Dr. Young previously also served as a CEO in the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, Fisheries, the Environment, and Sustainable Development. Now we would like to move on to the presentation. The first presentation is by me. If we could please have my presentation. No, not this one. This is Dr. Young's presentation. Mine is on private sector engagement. Yes, this one. Thank you so much. Okay, so this private sector strategy is something that was approved in our one of the most recent board in B32, and I'd be happy to walk you through this. Okay. So while working with the private sector for the past 7 years of our investment period, we have identified 4 key barriers, which is listed in red on the left-hand side. And we have created this 4-prong private sector strategy based on those barriers identified. So we have created, in response to developing countries' barrier on policy, market, and capacity front, we have our first pillar, which promotes a conducive investment environment for climate and economic growth activities. In response to developing countries' barrier in innovation, technology, and technicality, our second pillar will focus on accelerating the innovation for business models, financial instruments, and climate technologies. In response to barriers for mobilizing private finance at scale, our third pillar will focus on de-risking market-creating investment to crowd in private sector finance. And lastly, in response to barriers related to domestic financial systems and institutions, our fourth pillar will focus on strengthening domestic and regional financial institutions to scale up private finance. So let us look into this in more details. So the first pillar is going to be about readiness. We are becoming increasingly aware that the climate investment projects are often challenging because the necessary policy or framework are not yet in place. Here, GCF is trying to fill the gap and is trying to promote a conducive environment through the readiness program, where we will develop policies that targets private climate investment. Readiness also supports NDAs and direct access entities in the aim of maximizing co-benefits between mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development. Readiness can serve many different purposes over here. Just to exemplify, we can identify national priority and needs, build green finance knowledge and capacity of financial sector stakeholders, develop and issue green finance regulations or guidelines, promoting knowledge sharing and peer learning, or developing green financial products, institutions, and markets. And here comes our second prong. Innovative ideas in the climate markets can often be so new that it cannot materialize with private sector on its own. We are aware of that. And so here, in order to accelerate innovation for business models, financial instruments, and climate technologies, GCF will provide its capital, support for climate climate technology incubators and accelerators in developing countries, as well as the development of public-private innovation ecosystems. Moving on to the third prong, in de-risking market-creating investment to crowd in private sector finance, GCF will engage increasingly with local private sector actors, including micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. We will also focus on countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change, such as LDCs, SIDS, and African states. We will also actively consider the utilization of the diverse financial instrument of GCF, including exploring options to facilitate access to equity, guarantees, and insurance products. Our last prong is that we will be increasingly working with the financial institutions because we understand that strengthening of domestic and regional financial institutions could be quite critical to scaling up private climate finance. For example, GCF will strengthen the private sector financial institutions' capacity by co-investing in projects through them. And we can also support public development banks because we understand that in turn, they will finance the domestic and regional private sector financial institutions to increase their investment in climate. On the way forward, going forward, we leverage improvement in our processes to make it more accessible in terms of accreditation, and it would be hopefully less time consuming with some of the new modalities that we have, including the PSAA, the project-specific accreditation approaches, which will allow us to receive proposals without an accredited entity. It's going to be a project-specific accreditation. The areas of potential programming would be clean and just energy transition, food security and agriculture, transformation in LDCs, industrial deep decarbonization, climate resilient infrastructure in LDCs and SIDS, nature-based climate adaptation, as well as blue oceans. One of the case studies that I'd like to raise is over here with Climate Investor 2, which I have also introduced earlier in the water session. But this is a truly an innovative case from our side because it achieved the mobilizing of the private sector finance in the area that is usually not attracting a lot of private sector financing. Water is typically a public sector heavy financing sector. We look forward to receiving more of this kind of proposal going forward. And now I would like to pass the floor to Amar for him to cover the energy and the shift to from mitigation to adaptation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ayaka. Really a pleasure to be here. Thanks to you all for spending the last slot of the afternoon with us here on stage. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with you about some issues close to our hearts. So as Ayaka said, this session, at least from my perspective in this panel, is two things. Yeah, one, how's the private sector really driving and contributing to the just transition that we need to see across the world? And two, how do we fundamentally understand and make that shift towards adaptation? And what does adaptation really look like, and how does the private sector contribute to adaptation? So those are the two kind of core themes. I want to kick us off with really a call to action. Pope Francis calls climate change a brutal act of injustice inflicted toward the poor. And Africa is where it hits hardest. 55% of the world's poorest people live in Africa. And those are the folks that are most vulnerable to climate change and the statistics around how climate will result in greater stochasticity and greater harsh events from the climate. So adaptation is really at the heart of economic transformation. What you're seeing in Africa is a need for more energy in order to build resilience and energy to build economic productivity. And adaptation is really at the heart of driving that. And you see an extraordinary level of demand. So because many countries in Africa are starting from such a low base of energy consumption and economic activity, and energy consumption and economic activity go together, we need to crowd in an extraordinary amount of capital. So $170 billion a year into sub-Saharan Africa in order to meet our climate goals. It's something that we have never done before, and the call to action is that we really need to step up to make this happen. And we don't only need to make it happen from a mitigation perspective, to bring the capital to work and to make the system work better, but we need a just transition. And what do we mean by a just transition? It's a transition where people really matter. And when you think about this through an adaptation lens, it goes from thinking about products and services to thinking about customers and users. So a transition that's fair, that's inclusive, and that's equitable, and that creates opportunity, it creates jobs, it creates income, it reduces vulnerability, and it drives productivity. So that's what a just transition means to us. As Ayaka said, I'm the managing director of the Kawisafi Fund. We've, together with GCF, already invested just under $100 million in off-grid energy systems in Africa, directed at some of the most underserved and marginalized communities. So GCF was the first investor to support our fund, got us to crowd in more capital, and then to drive to results. And we've so far made 10 investments in the region that have been driving towards two key goals. One has been, let's get as many people into energy access as possible. So those who don't have energy now have energy. And two is, let's do that in a low carbon way and in a way that doesn't emit CO2. Some of the results already on the scoreboard. So over the last 4 years, 100 million people have been impacted through these investments. We've offset or averted 20 million tons of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalents. We've multiplied GCF's capital, one of the core requisites. How do we crowd in capital? We've multiplied GCF's capital by approximately 20 times. So for every $1 that GCF brought to the table, we've multiplied that by 20 times from other public and private sources, from debt and from equity. And we've seen our companies grow at an astonishing rate to feed the market that I talked about at the beginning, an underserved market across the world, across the continent and across Africa. So you've seen companies like D-Light, like Angaza, like Inspira Farms, delivering both C&I power as well as residential power across the continent. Ayaka already talked about some of the key challenges and some of the design considerations that GCF's going through to really focus, leverage, and scale its impact. And I wanted to reflect on a few of those in terms of our work and what we've been seeing on the ground. And again, in that same sort of pattern of here's what we'd like to see, here's what we've learned based on what the challenge is. So the challenge that we've seen is there's a real lack of access to low-cost capital. companies in the developing markets and emerging markets are often paying over 7 times what companies in the European and US markets are paying for debt. So we need to see blended equity capital structures that are sufficiently flexible to meet those market requirements. Blended equity because it crowds in debt. You don't get debt without equity. For every dollar of equity, we've been able to deploy at least $3 of debt. And so equity plays a really critical role in bringing a new capital to the market. There's often a poor investment climate. This means the regulations, the incentives, the structures in place to allow the private sector to really flourish and contribute to public goals, not often as strong as they can be. And so we see by having managers on the ground, companies on the ground, taking an ecosystem approach, looking for opportunities to blend public and private capital, looking for opportunities to identify public goals and see how the private sector can contribute to those goals, sharing insights and learning, doing the collaboration play is really critical. Third, we see a real struggle for talent, a war for talent, a war for experience, and a war for diversity on the ground. So companies are struggling to find the right people to ensure diversity. And this is where the GCF structure of blended capital that sits together with technical assistance can really make a difference, help to build those systems up, build that capacity up, and create incentives to drive change. And finally, when you look at the landscape across the continent, there's few early stage equity funds, there's few intermediaries that are willing to stand by companies to do that ecosystem building work and to build capacity over the long term, to lead investment terms so that we're setting prices, we're setting terms that crowds in and syndicates others. And there's a desperate need for more of those folks to get the type of support that GCF has to play with and to fundamentally drive on the ground. So those are some of the kind of 4 key points that we've seen in terms of our work on the ground and deploying capital across the continent, and 4 areas where we see real synergies with the GCF agenda that Ayaka, you talked about. So that's that first piece. Here's what the private sector is doing, and here's how we can leverage private sector, and here's how we can drive greater leverage of more capital towards our goals. The second piece, how do we meet the adaptation mandate? What does that adaptation mandate mean, and how do we deliver on it? It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to do it. So again, the headline on this one is shifting the lens from inputs to outputs, thinking about how do people receive the inputs that the private sector is able to do, that companies are able to deliver on, and look at it from the perspective of people on the ground. There's a set of challenges around adaptation, around how we define the indicators for success. How do we talk about we've achieved what we're trying to achieve here? The fact that we have interconnected systems, and it's always oftentimes very, very difficult to get clear attribution in the same way as you do around the mitigation targets. And that there's a series of complex concepts that are often quite hard to focus on in terms of both methodology and baseline. What we've seen on the ground, and as we've developed our second fund, what we've been finding on this journey is really change the approach. There are very often initiatives happening on the ground in Africa where adaptation is arising. It's just not being talked about, and we haven't framed it in the appropriate way. So there's many mitigation activities that result in adaptive responses and more resilience, but we haven't been able to conceptualize them as such. And a big part of our work has been doing that. So 1, focus on investments that really serve vulnerable, underserved communities, because that's where the impacts are going to be felt hardest. 2, ask the question, what really helps to drive resilience for people on the ground? Let's listen to what the responses to those questions are. 3, engage with people in the countries to understand what their needs and what their expectations are, and how does the private sector meet those through its innovations and its business models. Bring in external expertise to help our thinking, to shape our horizon, because we're at the horizon of what adaptation means here. So let's push that horizon and challenge ourselves to think better about it. And finally, how do we create those incentives that ensure that we take it seriously as managers and capital allocators, and that the companies we invest in take it seriously and get the results that we want to see on the ground. I just wanted to spend just half a minute talking through some of those ideas and help to illustrate it in a practical way. So sometimes these concepts become very abstract. So when you think about energy generation, you think about grid-based power, you think about the fact that droughts will reduce the amount of hydro capacity in many of the countries that we're investing in. So established capacity to deliver and generate power is going to be reduced. We're already seeing that in countries like Tanzania. So renewables plus storage can step into that breach and can improve resilience. When grid-based systems are suffering from poor infrastructure and underinvestment, they suffer when there's torrential downpours or there's high stochastic weather events. If you've been in Lagos or Nairobi and it rains, you often lose power. Having distributed renewable energy resources across those regions allows for power to be more localized, more stable, and of greater resilience for both businesses and for communities on the ground. In terms of productivity, extreme weather events reduces productivity. It takes away from the already low asset base that many vulnerable communities have. So access to power helps to build up those asset bases. So think of irrigation, for example. If you can have solar-powered irrigation, if you can have solar-powered cooling technology, it allows for greater agricultural productivity and it allows for less wastage. So somewhere like 40% of food wastage in Africa happens because of an absence of cooling and an absence of great distribution. So those are key areas. And finally, transportation. Transportation systems are increasingly fragile and fragmented as a result of floods, increased floods, droughts, and climate impacts. So again, think of the two-wheelers that are the backbone of transportation in Accra or in Nairobi. When it rains, those transportation systems fall down. When it floods, we have distraught service providers trying to get products and people to places. It's one of the biggest costs that businesses face across the continent. And electric vehicles offer one opportunity to help strengthen those systems and make them more resilient. I can talk about it more after the session and during questions. But the core heart of what we're trying to do in our second fund as we start to evolve into the space is really develop products and services that meet those needs, that respond to the adaptation challenges, and do it across these three columns that we've just spoken about. And our partnership with GCF, this is the last slide, is really about harnessing each of our capacities to build that collaborative framework to drive toward outcome. So we see GCF as a partner to build a better world in the world that we see out there. We see a clear focus on impact and outcome, and we share that clear focus. We have a shared ambition to go into markets where others typically fear to tread. We and GCF both want to see the impact happen on the ground and to drive that impact, recognizing that there are challenges, recognizing that there are risks, and those risks can be managed. We recognize that GCF's been critical in willing to lead and anchor new funds and new initiatives where others have typically been more reserved. This is the decisive decade. This is the moment where we all need to step up. Well, I say decade, it's now only 7 years for us to meet the Paris targets. Together, we need to do so much more. So that's the call to action. And I'm delighted to be here and be able to present it to you. But thanks very much for that.
Thank you so much, Omar, for this very interesting presentation and for sharing this very hands-on experience based on your Kawisapi and Acumen. I really appreciate Acumen's experience in the approach to adaptation because this is definitely something that we can all learn from. And I cannot wait to hear more from you on this in the panel. Thank you. Now, we'd like to move on to Dr. Young's presentation, please.
Thank you, Nayaka. And I know I'm the last speaker after a long day, and I'm standing between perhaps you and dinner, and that's never a good place to be. But nevertheless, I hope to share the experience of the 5 Cs in terms of how we've utilized the project preparation facility and the readiness portfolio from the GCF to help mobilize climate action on the ground. So my presentation is going to take a slightly different angle than Amar's, who is actually from the private sector. The Caribbean Community Climate Change Center is actually an intergovernmental organization that has been set up by the heads of government of the 15 Caribbean nations to coordinate the Caribbean's response to climate change. However, the modality of using the PPF and the readiness to catalyze climate finance in the public sector, particularly for adaptation, is very instructive of how the private sector can use those same modalities to mobilize and catalyze climate finance. So very quickly, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, our vision is a resilient and sustainable Caribbean region for all. We have a mission that is there in terms of initiating and coordinating the delivery of innovative and transformative evidence-based climate change solutions to improve the lives of Caribbean people. At the end of the day, this is what climate resilience is about. It's about improving people's lives and resilience to climate change on the ground. And the services we offer to the Caribbean, 15 CARICOM member states, are threefold. First, we are the repository of climate data for the Caribbean. We have the largest repository of Caribbean-specific climate data housed at the 5Cs. And that data is useful in terms of providing the climate rationale, as well as to advise policymakers for evidence-based decision-making. Two, we are a delivery partner to the GCF. We actually became accredited to the Green Climate Fund in 2015. We were the first accredited direct access entity in the region. We're also accredited to the Adaptation Fund. And since our establishment, we've invested over $260 million in climate change, adaptation, and resilience building measures in the region. And then we also coordinate the Caribbean's response and in negotiations as part of the UNFCCC process. We have a network of partnerships. This is how the center has been successful in doing what it does. Partnerships with our member states, partnerships with entities like the GCF and other donors, the Adaptation Fund, and bilateral entities like the European Union, and of course, a network of Caribbean regional institutions. No one entity has all of the expertise and all of the capacity to be able to deliver climate action, especially in an area that is distributed, small states, very insular, with capacity issues. And so our network of partnerships is absolutely critical for us to deliver services to the region. In terms of our GCF portfolio at a glance, we have currently 17 readiness projects that we're implementing in 11 countries in the Caribbean. We have a $45 million project being implemented in Barbados, which is it's an innovative project in potable water, where we use renewable energy to pump water from the 3 pumping stations. And it provides resilience in the event of storms, and the grid generation goes down. The solar PV systems ensure that water is pumped to the residents. In addition to that, we have a personal tank programs where 1,500 households have a tank that stores rainwater, that they can have access to water. Hospitals and polyclinics also have water tanks. There's a huge capacity building component. This project came out as a result of a PPF. The GCF provided 27.6 million in grant funds. We have 3 project preparation facility from the GCF currently, and we have a 300 million pipeline of projects, all that was made possible after we got the accreditation from the GCF. So our readiness experience in working with these countries has been in a number of areas, all intended to help build capacity to scale climate finance. So you can see the NDA strengthening, developing the country programs for the countries, working with them to develop concept notes so that we can scale climate finance, improving our engagement with the private sector. Very importantly, developing the gender strategies and the environmental and social safeguard systems, climate finance strategies, and so on. And this has been a key foundational investment by the GCF to allow countries to scale climate finance. In terms of our PPF experience, we have 3 that we're currently implementing. The first project is looking at renewable energy using a wild grass to feed it, to provide cogen power into the grid. The PPF is actually de-risking this project by looking at the design, doing the ESIA, doing the gender analysis. And this project has the potential, with private sector participation, to make Belize, the entire country of Belize, more energy secure using renewable energy by displacing fossil fuels. This project was approved in 2018, and we're hoping that it goes to the GCF board in 2023. So that's a 5-year process. That's one of the challenges I want to address in the question and answer portion. We also have another project for adaptive capacity of sugarcane farmers. What we're seeing is temperatures are increasing, rainfall is becoming more variable and drier. The yield and productivity of the sugarcane fields are decreasing. And this particular PPF is going to, again, deal with the ESIA, looking at the varieties that are resilient to climate change, that farmers can then experiment with and scale up. Again, that's in 2020, and we are hoping that that goes to the board in 2023. And then actually an amazing project that we are working with the GCF from a PPF that was approved in 2019. And this project, we were just informed today, is going to be going in front of the GCF board in October. And this is a $50 million project that is going to transform the wastewater sector in Barbados by using, again, renewable energy. And it's going to pump the water to the agricultural part of Barbados, do some aquifer recharge in the rainy season, and in the dry season, farmers would be able to rely on the treated water to irrigate their fields, thereby decreasing the demand on the aquifers. Again, a PPF of 1 million would essentially mobilize 50 million in climate resilient investments. So very quickly, here is, this is the project in Barbados, $1 million from another donor for a PPF that did the same thing that the GCF PPF would do. And then the GCF came in after the PPF had de-risked the project, did the gender, did the ESIA, did the design, did the feasibility, all of that, and came in with 27 million of grant funds. The government of Barbados co-financed 17 million. And to date, we've committed 82% of the funds, and it's absolutely transforming the water sector in Barbados. For small islands, developing states like those of us in the Caribbean, a small amount of money in the larger scheme of things can have transformational impact in a small country. And so we don't always have to think hundreds of millions in small countries. In terms of, the center does not have the type of private sector experience that Amar would have talked about, but what we have done is to use the PPFs and the readiness to engage the private sector to try to crowd in their participation in climate resilience building. So we are supporting, for example, the accreditation of development banks to meet the GCF accreditation criteria. To date, there is not a single private sector entity from the Caribbean that is accredited to the PCF. Obviously, that's a barrier that we have to try to solve. And also, we have a current couple of readiness projects in St. Kitts and Nevis that is trying to work with private sector entities to get accredited to access funding from the GCF. So the point I want to make here very quickly is that the facility from the PPF, from the GCF, and the readiness portfolio really has allowed the 5 Cs to develop projects with our member states that otherwise would have been very unlikely. because it invests up to $1.5 million in doing all of the analyses, the feasibility study, the design, the gender, all of that. And by doing so, it makes it more likely that the governments put skin in the game by committing resources that otherwise would not have been committed for a project as the ones that we are currently investing in. And really, what our experience is that to design a project at 50 million, the skill sets that are required, you need economists, you need if you're doing water, you need hydrologists, you need people who can do all of the various studies. That is what the PPF allows you to do, and the private sector can do the very same thing in terms of de-risking, using public money to de-risk the investments and then scale with private money via different kinds of instruments. And then finally, I do want to make special mention that at the last board meeting, I believe the GCF is going to allow a project-specific assessment approach, which allows private sector entities who are not accredited to, if they have one project that is ready, to approach the GCF for financing. I think that's going to allow greater participation of the private sector. And so I think the GCF should be commended for that. Just to wrap up very quickly, our recommendations based on our experience, there needs to be continuous engagement with the GCF through the various stages of the PPF so that we avoid pitfalls and gaps and delays at the end of the process. It would be helpful if the GCF provides model TORs to guide the direct access entities and private sector entities. Technical assistance that is provided by the GCF should go beyond just providing advice, but helping direct access entities and private sector entities in actually writing some of the more technical components where there is a capacity gap in the DAE or in the consultant. I think Amar raised a critical point in his presentation that the skill sets that we need in the private sector is also not there, in lots of cases, and it's not in the public sector either. And so with the GCF technical capacity assistance, we can help to bridge that gap. Obviously, the concept note endorsement by the GCF is still a barrier, so there needs to be some improvements for efficiency and effectiveness there. And then in cases of the both DAEs and the 5Cs, we allowing the PPF to fund the staffing in the direct access entities is a critical, I think, recommendation, because when you have consultants fly in, fly out, you never maintain the capacity within the region. And the private sector in the Caribbean, like the Pacific and like parts of the Indian Ocean, is not a uniform, heterogeneous, homogeneous entity. In the region where I'm from, about 80% of all of the private sector are small and medium-sized enterprises, where 50% of all the employment in the country comes from SMEs. In Jamaica, 90% of the private sector is small and medium-sized enterprises. So we have to ensure that we're not crowding out the private sector in our region by having criteria that obviously they're never going to meet. And that's a very important part if we're going to stimulate regional private sector participation in mobilizing climate finance. And so from our perspective, it's the PPF facility and the readiness modality from the GCF has been absolutely critical in mobilizing climate finance in the public sector. And we're absolutely sure it can do the same thing in the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Young, for sharing an excellent learning from your track record in readiness. I am really happy to hear that your project in Barbados in wastewater is going to the board in board B34 in October. I wish you all the best. And I do hope that the new PSAA modality will play to remove the barrier that the private sector is currently facing on the project front. Okay, now I would like to move on to the discussion and I'd like to now open the floor for questions or reflections that you may have based on the presentation that we have gone through. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Please go ahead. There's a microphone on your way.
Thank you very much. My name is Gareth Phillips. I'm the manager of climate and environmental finance at the African Development Bank. Sorry, not so much a question, but maybe just scope for comment to Amar and generally about the need to mobilize finance from the private sector. There's been a lot of focus, and in the previous session, we talked a bit about the carbon markets and so on. But I think actually, Amar, you touched on some of the points about adaptation and resilience. And I think that this is a much more powerful way to mobilize finance for projects, because if we look at it from a carbon market point of view, we know from our previous experience, and it was mentioned in the previous session as well, that much of the incentive around the carbon markets is about trading. Trading is a nice word for speculation, and speculation is what takes place away from the project in the developed country, in London and Singapore, where money is made on reselling carbon credits. If we approach financing projects through adaptation, because they're not fungible units, because every project gives different types of adaptation benefits, there is no trading, there's no speculation associated with it. So all the money goes to the project. And the problem is there's no demand for adaptation. And so let me propose to you, what do you think about the idea of developed countries creating an adaptation levy? So as we've made companies and the consumers pay for carbon, why don't we make them contribute towards the costs of adaptation and channel those funds into adaptation projects in Africa? Thank you very much.
Does this one work? Thanks very much for that. I have a couple of responses. The first is the carbon market piece is critical. We've already invested in a series of companies, from biogas companies through to cook stove companies, that are creating carbon credits and using those carbon credits to improve the value proposition to the customer. So what that means is they've been able to, in some cases, cut in half the cost of the product that they're selling on the street, which accelerates sales and makes those products much more affordable to a low-income user. So this idea of kind of radical affordability is something that carbon markets can play into and can actually accelerate and can actually promote. So we're seeing the evolution of that market and are positive about it. And I don't want to cast it as an either-or type construct. I think if you look at the task force on voluntary carbon markets, it's potentially $100 billion a year that we can talk about cleanly as the ability of the market to bring more value into emerging markets where there is insufficient resource, right? So rather than casting it as a debate around carbon markets offer the polluter an opportunity to pay their way out of a problem, which I think is something that we're all familiar with in these rooms, there's also a different framing, which is it's a way of bringing capital and lowering the cost of products by creating transfers between rich and poor, and making those markets work better. So I'm a big fan, and I think very much in favor, and obviously open to challenge and to hear different views. The idea of a sort of social credit, I think, is where you're coming from on adaptation. So can we start thinking about adaptation as a credit-worthy item in here? I think there are possibilities around that. I think the results-based financing world has spent a fair bit of time working with the private sector, talking about if certain results are generated, then certain financing can come into play. And I think we have a lot to learn from that. I think we have a lot to learn from innovations in climate finance around green bonds. In effect, that's a monetization of a green good, which we can translate in multiple ways. But we shouldn't be restricting it, I think, to simply green. I think what you're saying and what I would embrace is what are the ways that we could open up these sorts of instruments to material, measurable, manageable impact bonds or impact metrics that can start to play in the market. I think there's a lot of innovation to play for here. We would love to be at the forefront of that. We'd love to talk more with you about how we could start to crystallize some of those ideas and put those platforms in place that allow for those transfers to happen, but allow them to happen in a low friction, low cost way. I think part of the obstacle to date with many of the innovations in this space has been that they're very difficult to measure, they're very difficult to monitor. And unfortunately, the bureaucracy that then sits behind their implementation becomes so arduous. It's something that Colin and I were talking about yesterday, becomes so arduous that the private sector simply says, look, I can't be dealing with it. I'd rather put my capital somewhere else because it's just too complicated. So we have to keep our eye on that efficiency metric. But thanks for the question.
We have one more question from the floor. Please pass the microphone to the. Oh, there's two? Oh, okay. Well, first we will pass the microphone to the middle. Yes, thank you. And then we will move on to you. No, but first, yes, please go ahead.
Oh, all right. Thank you. Visiting from Antigua and Barbuda. So my question would be to, I believe, all the panelists in general, looking at the GCF as well as the other two persons on the floor. So I wanted to know what either of your organizations, what their approach would be to providing blended financing to different communities, taking into consideration that when we're looking at adaptation projects on a whole, a lot of times the targeted communities are usually vulnerable ones. And that's looking at even farmers, for example, we're looking a lot at agriculture and improving food security and looking at water scarcity. A lot of those persons are unable to access financing. And I know I missed a part of the presentation I was running between rooms, but I know that a lot of it at the beginning, each of you spoke about equity, and a part of blended financing would be looking at equity, loans, grants as one approach. So I just wanted to know, how would you approach that, looking at vulnerable communities, especially since a lot of their products, if we're looking at the agriculture sector, for example, they're focusing on the types of products that they're producing. How would that equity really benefit the organization that's providing this financing? And then my second question is if any of your organizations know about any projects or are already implementing any projects that are focused on blended financing. Thank you.
Amar, would you like to?
Colin, go first.
Okay, Dr. Colin, Dr. Young, please go ahead. Yes.
Is this working? Oh, it is. Thank you for the question. In terms of, you're absolutely right. Let me say first, in terms of trying to ensure that adaptation is happening at the local level and on the ground. That is where we're going to build resilience. It's hard to build resilience top down. And the 5 C's in terms of how we work normally with the governments. And also now we're working with civil society organizations who tend to have much more effective mechanisms for working directly with farmers and other vulnerable people on the ground. So we have a number of projects using GCF resources. For example, I mentioned about the sugarcane farmers in northern Belize who are seeing their yields decrease each year because of droughts and because of increased temperatures. In terms of using GCF resources that is going to be testing a number of drought-resistant varieties of sugarcane. And we're doing all of the agronomic trials to de-risk which of those varieties would then make sense under a changing rainfall regime. And then developing greenhouses that then the Sugarcane Association can scale because they represent the private sector interests and provide those varieties of sugarcane to their farmers as part of their association. So de-risking the investment by finding what these varieties are, and then obviously then the private sector would scale the availability of those seedlings that can be used on the farms. So that's one classic way that we can actually help the farmers. What we've found too, in terms of looking at adaptation, that in small island developing states, it is very difficult to think of a project of adaptation or mitigation or cross-cutting. The projects that we're working on with the GCF resources actually has a renewable energy component that by itself, the GCF would say that's mitigation. It actually has a water component, which we could look at both mitigation and adaptation. And then it also has a food security component. And when you put all of them together, each three pieces is an absolute resilience project, an adaptation project that is benefiting people on the ground. So we have not been in the space of providing innovative financial instruments or equity to the private sector. What we've done is to mobilize resources, and then we work with development banks and credit unions for them to on-lend those resources to the private sector at concessional rates.
Just a quick jump in, and again, a really great question. That we often talk about the private capital markets as being really smart and being dominated by really smart people, and sometimes I worry. Fundamentally, they can be really dumb. And what do I mean by that? I mean, capital chases the highest return for the lowest risk. And when we in these rooms look for private capital to come in and solve big public problems, yeah, it's much easier to fund Angry Birds out of California than it is to solve energy access in the Caribbean or East Africa. So we start from that sort of premise, is we have to show the way in rooms like this. We have to look for ways of bringing capital to the trough and make capital work in markets that matter. So this is where GCF, others have a really critical role of creating that magnetic attraction to capital to bring it to places where otherwise would fear to tread. And unfortunately, when you look at things like GFANZ and COP26, $3 trillion of climate capital being committed by public and private finance. When it comes to attracting that capital, and we know this from experience in raising funds, the amount of capital coming to Africa, Asia, the Caribbean is a tiny drop. It's like an immaterial drop. And it's shocking to really be confronted by that reality over and over and over again. So in answer to your question, direct answer to your question, it's essential. I mean, I can't overstate how important it is to create blended capital structures where we can build intelligently thought out systems where different layers of risk can be brought out and managed. And we can present a really magnetic, attractive proposition to bring that capital, because we desperately need that capital. As I say, so much easier to build the next app for something trivial and social than to solve for the kinds of climate problems that we have. And in this remaining decade, we don't have the time to waste thinking this stuff through. So let's do it, and let's do it now, and let's do it at scale. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Young and Yamar. Yes, please go ahead.
Watif from Sudan. Thank you all for the very informative presentations. It is a comment rather than a question. From Caribbean speaker, he comment GCF should provide guidelines and model TOR to guide DA and NDAs and to raise their capacity for the whole process. I think this is very important recommendation, and due to the different experience and challenge facing each country, there is real need to this sort of guidelines, and it could be customized to every country case. And in Sudan, we lack this type of guidelines and the experience and capacity building. And also I asked them, in the absence of these guidelines, how they deal with this matter. And solve this type of challenge. Thank you.
Dr. Young?
So the learn by doing is sort of what we have to do, and we engage with the GCF technical staff, and we go through quite a bit of iterations. Obviously, there are going to be projects that we've never worked on before, and so we don't have the in-house expertise. And when we have those types of projects, we kind of have to feel our way around and looking at what other delivery partners may have worked on in terms of similar projects. But what that does, it really lengthens the time between the concept and when you actually get project finance to actually do the implementation on the ground. If we're trying to find ways to improve efficiency and accelerate climate finance, then the GCF should work with its partners to do all it can to remove barriers by making things as easily understandable and to replicate it, so that we can tweak it to the national circumstances of each of the areas we're investing in, and thereby accelerate climate finance. And that's the point. So we should actually have the environment where we can learn from each other almost in real time in terms of what others are doing and how they're solving some of the barriers, and that can help everybody in capacity in areas where capacity is limited, as in our countries in Africa, LDCs and SIDS.
Thank you, Dr. Young. Do you have any more questions from the floor? In that case, I have one question to Amar. You mentioned rightly earlier that when we approach adaptation, there's one thing about saying and there's one thing about doing. I 100% agree with that. And I want to challenge you on the authenticity per se. How do we know what Acumen, how do we know Acumen is doing what it says it's doing, in your view?
No, thank you for the question. Look, the first thing I'd say is really important to be held to account. This work is critical and important work. If we fail in it, we all fail. There's so much at stake for us to succeed here that it makes no sense to embark on a greenwashing escapade. I think the reality for all of us is that there is sometimes a gap between what we say and what we can do, and we need to be authentic about how we close that gap. And it's incumbent on us, and Colin's talked about the preparation facilities, the need for talent, the expertise and the skills. We're all very much on the horizon here. We're on the boundary of what is possible in terms of talking about adaptation, evolving systems for adaptation. And that then implies how we monitor, we evaluate, and we report back that what we are saying is really what we are doing. And that's a critical part of this journey. I don't think it's solved yet. I don't think we've solved it. I don't know that GCF has solved it. I think we're asking the right questions. We've embarked with a robust framework. We come with good faith to say, these are the metrics that we want to be held accountable to, and we'll put our hands up to be held accountable to those metrics. The core thing is that the thesis that underlies those metrics is robust. And that, as Colin says, we're willing to learn by doing. So when the data tells us that we're doing it right, we do more of it. When the data tells us we're not doing it right, that we respect that, we reflect on it, and we redirect. But that constant evolution, that constant iteration, that constant learning is critical. And we don't get there without being authentic and without holding ourselves to account. So I think that's crucially important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amar, for sharing your opinion on this very interesting topic. Okay, so we are coming to the end of this session. Many thanks to everyone who has participated to this session. On behalf of GCF, I'd like to thank Amar and Dr. Young for participating to this enthusiastic and thought-provoking deliberations. Thank you so much. And it was truly a pleasure, and we look forward to working with you in the future projects. Thank you so much. And this.